The mile marker had my name on it. I had been driving for approximately 6 hours on a highway that stretched endlessly across a landscape that had gradually transformed from the familiar suburban terrain near my home into something progressively more remote and desolate. The drive was supposed to be a kind of pilgrimage, a solo journey to a cabin that I had rented for a week in an attempt to escape from the accumulated stress and complexity of my ordinary life. The cabin was located several hours away from the city where I lived, situated in a rural area that promised solitude and the kind of disconnection from constant connectivity that I desperately needed. I had driven similar routes many times before, and the journey had become almost meditative in its familiarity. The repetitive act of navigating the highway providing a kind of mental space in which my thoughts could wander and settle. I was driving past the mile marker when I first noticed it, though I did not immediately recognize the significance of what I was seeing. Mile markers are ubiquitous features of American highways, white rectangular signs with numbers indicating the distance from some arbitrary point of origin. They serve a practical function, allowing people to identify their location and to estimate their progress along a particular route. I had passed hundreds of these markers in my life without giving them much conscious attention, and I would have passed this one without registering it in any particular way except for the fact that something about it seemed unusual, seemed to stand out from the ordinary visual landscape in a way that my attention could not ignore. I slowed my vehicle, pulling over to the side of the road with a growing sense of disorientation and uncertainty about what I was actually seeing. The mile marker was identical in appearance to thousands of others, the same basic size and shape and coloration. But where a number should have appeared, indicating the distance from the arbitrary origin point, there was instead a name, my name. The letters were clearly visible, unmistakably spelling out my own name, the name that appeared on my driver's license and my birth certificate, and every official document that established my identity in the external world. I sat in my vehicle for several minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind attempting to process what I was observing. The rational part of my consciousness generated a series of possible explanations almost immediately. Perhaps this was some kind of elaborate prank, carried out by friends who had somehow discovered the specific route that I would be taking on this particular day, and had arranged for someone to install a custom mile marker as some kind of joke. Perhaps I was misreading what I was seeing, my tired mind and the glare of the afternoon sunlight combining to create a false perception that my name appeared where a number should have been. Perhaps I was experiencing some kind of psychological episode, a dissociative state in which my mind was imposing patterns onto ordinary reality in accordance with some unconscious concern or preoccupation. But even as these rational explanations formed in my mind, I found myself unbuckling my seatbelt and exiting the vehicle to examine the marker more closely. The afternoon heat was intense, and there was little traffic on this particular stretch of highway. The landscape on either side of the road was sparse and undeveloped, consisting primarily of scattered trees and dry grassland that suggested the climate was arid and the population density was low. I walked toward the mile marker, my legs slightly unsteady from the prolonged sitting, my eyes fixed on the sign that seemed to present an impossible contradiction to my understanding of how the world was supposed to function. As I approached the marker, I could see with perfect clarity that what I had perceived from the vehicle was accurate. The sign displayed my name with absolute distinctness. The letters were professionally rendered, the same size and style as the numbers that appeared on other markers. There was no indication that this was a vandalized sign or that something had been applied to it after the original manufacture. The name appeared to be an integral part of the marker itself, as though the marker had been created specifically for this purpose. As though somewhere in the process of manufacturing highway mile markers, someone had decided that this particular marker would bear my name instead of a number. I stood in front of the marker for a considerable length of time, attempting to determine what the implications of this discovery might be. The most obvious implication was that someone had deliberately placed this marker here, someone who knew my name and who was aware that I would be driving this particular route. This suggested that the marker was part of some kind of intentional communication, some kind of message directed specifically at me, but the nature of the message was unclear. Was this a threat? Was it a sign of some kind? Was it part of some elaborate game or performance art project? Was it possible that someone was stalking me, that they had tracked my movements and arranged for this marker to be installed as a way of demonstrating their knowledge of my whereabouts? I retrieved my phone from my vehicle and took several photographs of the marker from different angles, documenting the discovery in case I needed evidence that what I was experiencing was real. I attempted to search online for information about the marker, trying to determine if there was any news or discussion about a modified mile marker on this particular highway. My search results yielded nothing. No evidence that anyone else had noticed or reported this anomaly. No indication that this discovery was anything other than something that existed only in my particular experience. I returned to my vehicle and continued driving, my mind now preoccupied with the question of what I had seen and what it might mean. The drive to the cabin, which had previously felt meditative and peaceful, now felt charged with an underlying anxiety that I could not entirely suppress. I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently, wondering if I was being followed, wondering if whoever had arranged for the marker to be installed was also tracking my progress along the highway. When I arrived at the cabin several hours later, my sense of solitude and safety had been significantly compromised by the encounter with the mile marker. The cabin itself was rustic but comfortable, a small structure situated on the edge of a small lake, surrounded by pine forest on all sides. It was the kind of place that promised isolation and contemplation, a refuge from the complexities and demands of ordinary social life. I had rented it through an online platform, paying in advance, providing my personal information as part of the booking process. The property management company had sent me instructions about how to access the cabin, where to find the key, which utilities were available, and what the rules and restrictions were regarding use of the facility. It had seemed like a straightforward transaction, a simple exchange of money for temporary access to a peaceful location. But now, standing in the cabin with the knowledge that my name appeared on a mile marker somewhere along the highway that I had just traveled, the seemingly ordinary nature of the transaction took on a more sinister character. Had someone who had access to the property management system or who was in contact with the property manager used this information to trace my location and arrange for the marker to be installed? Or was this a bizarre coincidence, the implausible result of some random series of events that happened to intersect with my personal journey in an uncanny way? I spent the evening attempting to calm myself through various practical means. I made a cup of tea, sat on the porch of the cabin overlooking the lake, and attempted to engage in the kind of meditative thinking that I had originally intended this trip to facilitate. I told myself that I was almost certainly overreacting to what was likely an ordinary and explicable phenomenon, that I was allowing an unusual experience to trigger an anxiety response that was disproportionate to the actual level of threat. And yet, underneath these rational reassurances, there remained a persistent sense of unease, a nagging awareness that something about the situation was profoundly wrong in ways that I could not quite articulate or make sense of. The next morning, I made the decision to drive back to the location of the mile marker, to examine it again in daylight and to attempt to gather more information about how it had come to be placed there. The drive took several hours, but when I arrived at the location where I had stopped the previous day, I found that the mile marker was no longer there. The spot where it had been was empty except for some dirt and grass, with no indication that any marker had ever occupied that location. I drove up and down the highway for several miles in both directions, attempting to locate the marker or to find any evidence that it had been there, but I found nothing. This disappearance of the marker only deepened my sense of confusion and destabilization. If the marker had actually existed, then who had removed it? Had someone been monitoring my reactions to its presence and had decided to eliminate the evidence before I could investigate further or bring it to the attention of authorities? Or had I imagined the entire experience, my mind constructing a detailed and vivid false memory of discovering something that had never actually existed? The experience of searching for the marker and finding nothing where I was certain I had seen something filled me with a kind of existential dread, a recognition that my own perceptual and cognitive processes might not be entirely reliable. I returned to the cabin in a state of considerable agitation, my attempt at restorative solitude now transformed into something closer to a nightmare. I tried to contact the property management company to ask questions about the location of the cabin and about the history of the property, but I received automated responses suggesting that I should consult the information that had been provided with my booking. I searched online for any information about mile markers being installed or removed on this particular highway, but I found no news reports or discussion about such an event. It was as though the entire experience had occurred in a kind of parallel reality, a version of events that had happened only in my perception and in no objective reality. The next few days passed in a state of increasing psychological distress. I found myself ruminating obsessively about the mile marker, about what it might have meant, about how it could have appeared and then disappeared. I attempted various explanations, each more elaborate than the last. Perhaps I had been drugged. Perhaps someone had slipped something into my food or water before my trip that was causing me to experience hallucinations. Perhaps I was having some kind of neurological episode, perhaps a brain tumor, or some other organic disorder was causing me to perceive things that were not there. Perhaps I was experiencing the early stages of a psychiatric illness. Perhaps a psychotic break was beginning to manifest itself through these strange experiences. But alongside these dark and troubling explanations, another possibility continued to suggest itself to me. A possibility that was in some ways even more disturbing than the alternatives. What if the mile marker had actually been there? What if I had genuinely seen what I perceived myself to see? What if someone had deliberately placed a marker bearing my name on a highway that I would be traveling? And what if someone had then removed it before I could gather conclusive evidence or call attention to it? This possibility suggested that someone had a detailed knowledge of my movements and my plans, that I was being monitored in ways that I did not fully understand, that I was the subject of some kind of coordinated action by people or entities whose intentions and motivations remained obscure. I made the decision to cut short my stay at the cabin and to return to my home in the city. The solitude that I had sought was no longer restorative. Instead, it felt isolating and frightening. I needed to be around other people, to verify that my perceptions and cognitions were functioning properly, to escape from the psychological space that the mile marker experience had created. As I was preparing to leave, I discovered something that only deepened the strangeness of the situation. On the dashboard of my vehicle, I found a piece of paper that I had not placed there, a printed note that contained a single sentence: "You are exactly where you are supposed to be." The note appeared to have been placed there sometime while my vehicle was parked at the cabin. I had locked the doors, I was certain of that, but somehow someone had managed to access the interior of the vehicle and to leave this message. This was the first piece of physical evidence that something beyond my own mind was actually occurring. The first concrete indication that my experiences were not hallucinations or delusions, but were part of some reality that was unfolding around me. And yet, the message itself was cryptic and offered no clarification about the intentions of whoever had written it or about what was actually happening. The drive back to the city was marked by a constant vigilance that exhausted me. I found myself checking my mirrors obsessively, taking random turns and driving in circles to see if I could identify whether I was being followed. I varied my driving speed and took detours through small towns, attempting to lose any potential pursuer. I stopped at rest areas and examined my vehicle from all angles, looking for tracking devices or any indication that someone had tampered with it. I was aware that this behavior was probably not entirely rational, that I was allowing fear and anxiety to drive my actions in ways that might attract unwanted attention, and yet I could not entirely suppress the impulse to attempt to protect myself from whatever was happening. When I finally arrived back at my home, I found another note, this one placed on my front door. The note read, "You already know what you are looking for. You have always known." I stood on my front porch, holding this note in my trembling hands, my mind struggling to make sense of what was occurring. The notes were suggesting something, were pointing me towards some kind of understanding or recognition, but I could not determine what that understanding or recognition was supposed to be. I contacted the local police and reported that someone had been leaving notes at my residence and had possibly tampered with my vehicle. The officers who came to take my report seemed sympathetic but skeptical, and I could sense their doubt about whether I was actually the target of some kind of harassment, or whether I was experiencing the kind of psychological crisis that could manifest as a belief that one was being persecuted. I could not provide them with any solid evidence beyond the notes themselves, and the notes, while strange, were not explicitly threatening and could not be conclusively attributed to any particular individual. Over the following weeks, I received additional notes, each one appearing in different locations: on my car, on my desk at work, on my apartment door, in my mailbox. Each note contained a cryptic message that seemed to be pointing towards some kind of understanding or realization. The path is already marked. You chose this before you were born. The mile marker is a marker of your true destination. Everything you are looking for is within the mile marker. The pattern of messages suggested that someone was trying to communicate something to me, was trying to guide me towards some kind of realization or action, but the meaning remained frustratingly obscure. I attempted to trace the source of the notes to determine who was leaving them and for what purpose. I set up a camera pointed at my apartment door, but the footage never captured anyone placing a note. I examined the notes themselves for any clues about who had written them, looking for handwriting samples or any indication of the writer's identity, but the notes appeared to have been printed using a standard computer printer, offering no personal characteristics that might identify the author. It was as though the notes were appearing through some mechanism that bypassed ordinary physical processes, some way of communicating that did not conform to the normal rules of how objects move through space and how people left physical traces of their actions. I began to consider the possibility that the mile marker was not meant to be taken literally, that it was instead a symbol or a metaphor for something else, something that I was supposed to understand about myself or my life. The phrase mile marker typically refers to a marker placed at specific intervals along a road, indicating distance traveled and distance remaining to reach a destination. What if, in the context of my life and my existence, I was being presented with a mile marker, not a physical object on a highway, but a metaphorical marking point in my journey through existence, a recognition that I had reached some particular stage or threshold in my life that was significant in ways I did not yet understand? This interpretation began to resonate with me in a way that the literal interpretations had not. I found myself reflecting on my life, on the choices I had made and the paths I had taken, on the fundamental questions about meaning, purpose that I had been avoiding through the constant busyness and distraction of ordinary life. The trip to the cabin, which I had framed as a simple escape from stress, began to seem like something more significant, like an intentional removal of myself from my ordinary environment, so that I could be presented with something that would force me to confront deeper questions about who I was and what my life was for. The mile marker, with my name inscribed on it, began to seem like a way of marking a particular moment, a moment in which I was being called to pay attention to something about myself or my situation that I had been neglecting. The fact that the marker had disappeared after I found it, and that the communication about it had continued through the cryptic notes, suggested that the physical marker was less important than what it represented, less important than the process of awakening or recognition it had catalyzed. I began to research the concept of synchronicity, the idea that meaningful coincidences could occur in ways that transcended simple causality, the theory proposed by Carl Jung that the universe could arrange events in ways that produced profound meaning, even though conventional causality could not explain how those arrangements had occurred. I read about instances in which people had received messages or encountered signs that had seemed impossible or inexplicable, but that had ultimately led them to significant insights or transformations. I considered the possibility that what was happening to me was a form of synchronicity, a series of apparently impossible events that were arranged by some force or intelligence in order to communicate something important to me about my existence. The notes continued to arrive, and gradually they began to coalesce around a common theme. They began to emphasize the importance of returning to a location, of finding the place where the mile marker had been, of understanding what the marker had been trying to communicate through its placement. One note read, "Return to where you found me. The answer is in the returning." Another stated, "The mile marker was a sign of your arrival at a threshold. Cross the threshold and discover what was always meant for you." I made the decision to make another trip, to drive back to the location of the highway where I had discovered the mile marker, and to investigate more carefully what might be there, what might be waiting for me in that location. I approached the journey with a sense of purpose and intention that was quite different from the anxiety and dread that had characterized my first return trip. I felt as though I was moving towards something rather than away from it, that I was answering a call rather than fleeing from a threat. When I arrived at the location where the marker had been, I found that there was now a small path leading away from the highway into the forest. The path was not obvious at first glance, but once I noticed it, I could see that it was marked in subtle ways. Small stone cairns placed at intervals, ribbons tied to tree branches, signs that indicated someone had deliberately created a way to guide people from the highway into the surrounding wilderness. I began to follow this path, moving deeper into the forest, my vehicle left behind on the shoulder of the highway. The path led me through terrain that became progressively more remote, deeper into areas where the landscape showed no sign of human habitation or development. I walked for what might have been 2 hours, though time seemed to move strangely in that environment, and I found myself arriving at a small clearing in which stood a cabin very similar to the one I had rented earlier, except that this cabin appeared to be much older and showed signs of having been unoccupied for a considerable length of time. I approached the cabin and found that the door was unlocked. Inside, I discovered a space that seemed to be organized as a kind of shrine or repository of information about myself. The walls were covered with photographs from my life, images of places I had been and people I had known, newspaper clippings related to events from my past, documents related to decisions I had made. There were journals filled with handwriting that I recognized as my own, but that I had no memory of having written, describing experiences that I did not remember having, analyzing aspects of my psychology and my life in ways that were deeply intimate and strangely accurate. In the center of the cabin, on a simple wooden table, sat a leather-bound journal that appeared much older than the others. I opened it and found that it was written in my handwriting, but the handwriting was younger, less developed than my current writing. The journal was dated from a period of my life that I had largely forgotten about, from when I was a teenager, struggling with questions about identity and purpose. But the contents of the journal went far beyond what I actually remembered from that period. The journal described a kind of visionary experience in which I had perceived my entire life laid out before me, in which I had seen myself at different ages and in different circumstances, and in which I had understood that my life was marked by specific waypoints, specific moments that would be significant turning points. The journal described the mile marker as one of these waypoints, a marking point that I had somehow known about on some level of consciousness that transcended my ordinary waking awareness. It described the marker as a symbol of a threshold I would cross, a point beyond which I would no longer be able to return to the way I had been living, the way I had been thinking about myself and about what my life meant. It suggested that I had consciously arranged for the marker to appear, that some aspect of myself that existed outside of ordinary space and time had manifested it in the physical world as a way of awakening the part of myself that had written the journal all those years ago. As I read the journal, I found myself experiencing a kind of recognition that went beyond intellectual understanding. It was as though I was remembering something that I had always known, but had forgotten, as though I was recovering a part of myself that had been lost or suppressed. The visionary experience described in the journal seemed to align perfectly with the experiences I had been having, the mile marker, the notes, the mysterious path leading through the forest to this cabin filled with evidence of my own past and my own intentions. I spent the night in cabin, reading through the journals and the documents that had been left for me, piecing together a narrative about myself that was far more complex and far more intentional than I had previously understood. I came to recognize that somewhere, at some level of consciousness that transcended my ordinary awareness, I had planned for these events to occur. I had somehow arranged for the mile marker to appear at a specific moment in my life, when I would be ready to encounter it, when I would be prepared to acknowledge the reality of what I had always known about myself and about the trajectory of my existence. By the time morning arrived, I felt fundamentally changed. The confusion and anxiety that had characterized my initial encounter with the mile marker had been replaced by a sense of profound understanding and acceptance. The mile marker had not been placed there by some external force trying to communicate with me. It had been placed there by myself, by some aspect of myself that existed in a realm beyond ordinary consciousness, that had been orchestrating my life in ways I had never fully recognized before. I left the cabin and made my way back to the highway, back to my vehicle, back to the ordinary world from which I had temporarily departed. The notes stopped coming after that. I never received another cryptic message, never encountered another sign pointing me toward some deeper understanding. But the understanding itself remained integrated into my being in a way that could not be unmade or forgotten. I had discovered the mile marker with my name on it, and in finding it, I had discovered something profound about myself, something about the ways that consciousness could stretch across time and arrange events in patterns of meaning and purpose that transcended the boundaries of ordinary causality. The mile marker had my name on it continued. In the months following my discovery of the cabin and my encounter with the journals that seemed to document a version of my life that transcended my ordinary memory, I found myself navigating a strange and uncertain landscape between two different ways of understanding reality and my own existence. The transformative experience that I had undergone in that remote cabin had left me fundamentally altered, but the alteration was not a simple matter of having gained new knowledge or new perspectives. Instead, I had undergone something more like a fundamental shift in the ground of my being, a reorganization of how I understood causality and agency, and the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. I returned to my ordinary life, to my job and my apartment and my routines, but I carried within me the knowledge that everything I had previously understood about how the world worked was incomplete, that there were dimensions of reality and consciousness that operated according to principles that I had never previously encountered in my educational or professional training. The most immediately destabilizing aspect of this transformation was the difficulty of attempting to integrate this new understanding into a life that continued to operate according to ordinary conventions and expectations. I went to work each day and performed my job duties competently, but there was a part of me that was no longer entirely present in that ordinary world. A part of my consciousness remained engaged with the questions that the discovery of the cabin had raised, preoccupied with the implications of the experience, attempting to understand how it was possible that I could have consciously arranged for events to occur in my physical reality without any memory of having made that conscious arrangement. I found myself increasingly unable to engage in the kind of casual conversation and ordinary social interaction that characterized the workplace environment. My colleagues began to notice that something was different about me, that I was more distant and more contemplative than I had been before. Some of them expressed concern, asking me if everything was all right, if I was dealing with some kind of personal crisis. I attempted to reassure them, to suggest that I was simply going through a period of transition and change, but I knew that my reassurances were not entirely convincing because I myself was not entirely convinced that everything would be all right. In any conventional sense of the term, the certainty that I had felt in the cabin, the sense that I had always known about the mile marker, and that I had consciously arranged for it to appear as part of some larger pattern of intention and meaning in my life, began to erode as I returned to my ordinary environment. The rational part of my mind, which had been temporarily quieted by the intensity of the experience, began to reassert itself, offering alternative explanations for what I had encountered. Perhaps the cabin was not actually a place I had arranged for some future version of myself, but rather a place that had been created by someone else, someone who had an unhealthy fixation on me and had used my personal information to construct an elaborate simulation of my own mind. Perhaps the journals were not written in my handwriting, but in a handwriting that was merely similar enough to convince me under conditions of psychological stress and disorientation. Perhaps I had experienced some kind of dissociative episode in which my mind had constructed an entire narrative of events that had not actually occurred in the way I remembered them. These alternative explanations offered the reassurance of rationality, the comfort of understanding my experience as a psychological phenomenon rather than as evidence of something that transcended the known laws of physics and causality. But they also offered a kind of existential horror, the possibility that I was experiencing the early stages of a mental illness, that my ability to distinguish between reality and delusion was beginning to fail, that the coherent self that I had always taken for granted was fragmenting in ways that might be progressive and ultimately catastrophic. This alternative explanation was in some ways more frightening than the implications of accepting the experience as genuine, because it suggested that I could not trust my own mind, that the foundations of my sense of self and my ability to navigate the world were potentially unstable. I made the decision to seek professional help, to consult with a therapist or psychiatrist who might be able to help me understand what was happening to me and whether what I had experienced was evidence of mental illness or evidence of something else entirely. I found a psychiatrist in my area and scheduled an appointment, approaching the session with a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that the professional could help me understand what was occurring, dread that the professional would confirm my deepest fears about my own sanity. When I began to describe my experiences to the psychiatrist, I found myself carefully selecting which aspects of the story to emphasize and which aspects to downplay. I described the initial discovery of the mile marker bearing my name, but I did not emphasize the certainty with which I had perceived it, the vividness and the absolute clarity of the experience. I described the notes that had appeared in various locations, but I presented them in a way that suggested I might be exaggerating their frequency or their significance. I described finding the cabin and reading the journals, but I presented this discovery in a way that invited skepticism. T suggested I might be uncertain about whether I had actually found such a place, or whether I might be confabulating the memory. The psychiatrist listened to my account with a kind of careful attention that suggested she was assessing not just the content of what I was saying, but also the way that I was saying it, looking for signs of thought disorder or delusional thinking. When I finished describing my experiences, she asked me a series of questions designed to assess my current mental state, whether I was experiencing auditory or visual hallucinations at present, whether I was having difficulty distinguishing between my thoughts and external reality, whether I was experiencing ideas of reference where I interpreted random events as having personal meaning directed at me specifically. I answered these questions with careful honesty, acknowledging that my experiences had involved a blurring of the boundary between external and internal reality, that I had interpreted random or coincidental events as meaningful messages directed specifically at me. But I also attempted to explain that this interpretation seemed reasonable given the specific nature of the experiences, that the discovery of my name on a mile marker was not the kind of thing that occurred randomly or coincidentally, that there seemed to be an intentional pattern underlying the sequence of events. The psychiatrist prescribed me an antipsychotic medication and suggested that I take it for a period of time to see if it helped to reduce the intensity of the experiences I was having. She also suggested that I engage in weekly therapy sessions to work through some of the psychological issues that might be underlying the strange experiences. She was sympathetic and not dismissive, but it was clear from the tenor of the conversation that she believed I was experiencing some form of psychotic illness, that the experiences I was describing were manifestations of delusional thinking rather than evidence of something that was actually occurring in physical reality. I began taking the medication as prescribed, and over the course of several weeks I noticed that the intensity of my preoccupation with the mile marker experience began to diminish. The constant rumination about what I had discovered, the persistent sense that I was supposed to do something or understand something about the experience, gradually faded. The medication seemed to be working as intended, reducing the intensity of the ideas of reference that had characterized my thinking, making it easier to dismiss the experiences as products of my own mind rather than evidence of something external. But alongside the reduction in distress came a corresponding reduction in the sense of meaning and purpose that the experience had brought. The world began to feel flatter, more ordinary, less charged with significance. The medication that was supposed to help me seemed instead to be stripping away something essential, something that gave depth and resonance to my existence. I found myself experiencing a kind of depression that was not characterized by sadness exactly, but rather by a kind of existential flatness, a sense that nothing really mattered, and that the search for meaning and pattern in my existence was ultimately a futile enterprise. After several weeks of this experience, I made the decision to discontinue the medication without consulting my psychiatrist, a decision that I recognized was probably not advisable, but that seemed necessary to me. Almost immediately upon stopping the medication, the intensity of my engagement with the significance of the mile marker experience returned. The sense that there was something important that I was supposed to understand, some pattern or meaning that I was supposed to recognize, came flooding back with renewed force. But this time, the return of the intensity was accompanied by a kind of sadness and resignation that had not been present before. I had experienced what it felt like to have the experiences medicated away, to have the sense of significance and meaning stripped from my existence in the name of mental health. And I had realized that even though the experiences might be products of my own mind, even though they might be symptoms of some form of psychotic illness, they were also the source of what made my life feel meaningful and real in a way that ordinary existence did not. I discontinued therapy sessions and stopped attempting to seek professional help for the experiences. Instead, I made the decision to accept them as part of my reality, to stop fighting them or attempting to explain them away, to instead explore them more deeply and to attempt to understand what they were trying to communicate to me. This decision was, in some sense, a decision to embrace a kind of deliberate delusion, to accept that I might be experiencing a mental illness, but to choose to engage with it rather than to attempt to suppress it. In the months that followed, I began to develop a different kind of relationship with the experience of the mile marker and everything that had followed from it. I began to research extensively into the philosophical and scientific questions that the experience had raised. I read books about the nature of consciousness, about theories of time and causality, about quantum mechanics and the role of observation in determining reality. I explored spiritual and religious traditions that suggested that consciousness might extend beyond the boundaries of individual minds, that there might be dimensions of reality that were accessible through altered states of consciousness or through spiritual practice. I found myself particularly drawn to the work of researchers who were investigating phenomena that transcended the conventional boundaries of what was considered scientifically possible. I read about studies on precognition and retrocausality, about experiments suggesting that consciousness might be able to influence physical reality in ways that contradicted classical physics. I read about case studies of individuals who reported experiencing the same kinds of synchronistic events and meaningful coincidences that I had experienced, who described lives in which events seemed to be arranged in patterns of significance that went beyond what could be explained by random chance. I began to develop a theoretical framework for understanding my experience, a framework in which the mile marker was not simply a delusion or a hallucination, but rather a manifestation of what some researchers called meaningful synchronicity, a pattern of events arranged by some unknown principle or force in ways that produced significance and meaning for the observer. According to this framework, the consciousness of an individual extended beyond their ordinary awareness, operating on a level that could arrange events in the physical world without the person's conscious knowledge or intention. The mile marker, with my name on it, was, in this framework, a way that my own deeper consciousness was communicating with my ordinary consciousness, a way that the deeper parts of myself that existed outside of linear time were marking a significant threshold in my existence. This theoretical framework provided me with a way of understanding the experience that did not require me to accept that I was mentally ill, but that also did not require me to accept that something impossible had occurred. The experience could be real in the sense that mattered most. It could have real effects on my consciousness and on the trajectory of my life, without being real in the sense of being a physical object that had been placed by some external agent on a highway in my reality. As I developed this understanding, I found myself beginning to notice other instances of meaningful synchronicity in my life, other moments in which events seemed to arrange themselves in patterns of significance. I began to develop the practice of paying attention to these moments, of recognizing them as potential communications from the deeper levels of my own consciousness, of attempting to understand what the patterns might be trying to communicate to me. One day, approximately a year after my initial discovery of the mile marker, I received a phone call from my mother. She told me that she had been going through some of her old possessions and had discovered a journal that I had written when I was a teenager, a journal that she had found among some boxes in the basement of the house where I had grown up. She was calling to ask me if I wanted her to send the journal to me or if I wanted her to throw it away. I felt a sudden surge of recognition and significance when she mentioned this, and I asked her to read me some of the entries from the journal. What my mother read to me was extraordinary. The journal contained numerous references to visions and dreams that I had experienced as a teenager, visions in which I had seen my entire life laid out before me, in which I had perceived specific moments and thresholds that would be significant turning points in my existence. One of these visions was described in detail in the journal, and it matched almost perfectly with the experience I had undergone in the cabin, with the journals I had found there, with the descriptions of the mile marker as a significant marker of a threshold. The journal described the mile marker as a symbol that would appear at a specific moment in my life, marking the point at which I would need to make a fundamental choice about the direction my life would take. The realization that the journals I had found in the cabin were not simply artifacts of my own mind, but were reflections and elaborations of things that I had actually written down decades earlier, produced a profound shift in my understanding of my experiences. I had not simply constructed a false memory of having written the journals appeared to be genuine descriptions of visions and experiences that I had actually had as a teenager, descriptions that had somehow manifested in a physical location that I had discovered as an adult, descriptions that aligned with experiences I was actually having in my present life. This discovery suggested a kind of causality that transcended linear time, a way in which events occurring in my present could somehow reach backward and arrange things that had occurred in my past, a way in which my consciousness could exist in a kind of eternal present that encompassed past and future simultaneously. The mile marker had not been placed there by me in my present consciousness, but the broader pattern of which the mile marker was a part had been established by me at a level of consciousness that existed outside of time, a level at which past and future were simultaneously present and knowable. I asked my mother to send me the journal from my teenage years, and when it arrived, I spent hours reading through it, finding numerous passages that seemed to describe experiences I was having in my present life, that seemed to predict the discovery of the cabin and the journals, that seemed to lay out a kind of roadmap for the trajectory my life would take. The experience of reading my own words from decades earlier, words that described things that were happening in my present moment with remarkable accuracy, produced in me a kind of emotional catharsis, a release of accumulated tension around the question of whether my experiences were real. The reality that I came to understand through this discovery was not a reality in which some external force had been arranging events in my life, but rather a reality in which my own consciousness, operating at a level that transcended ordinary temporal and spatial limitations, had been orchestrating the events of my life in accordance with a pattern that had been established long before I began living it. The mile marker with my name on it had been a way of marking a threshold, a moment at which I was meant to wake up to this reality, to begin to recognize that my life was not a series of random events, but rather an unfolding of a pattern that had been established before I was born. A pattern that my consciousness had participated in creating at a level that existed outside of ordinary space-time. This understanding produced in me a fundamental shift in how I related to the events of my life and to the question of my own agency and responsibility. If my consciousness had somehow arranged the events of my life in accordance with a pattern established outside of time, then in what sense was I responsible for those events? In what sense did I have the freedom to make choices if those choices were already predetermined by patterns that had been established in some realm outside of ordinary causality? These questions led me into deeper philosophical and spiritual investigation, into conversations with people who had studied mystical traditions and esoteric philosophies, into books that explored the relationship between free will and determinism, between divine predestination and human agency. What I came to understand through these investigations was that the dichotomy between free will and determinism was itself a false binary, that it was possible for my consciousness to have arranged the events of my life in accordance with a predetermined pattern, while simultaneously maintaining complete freedom and agency in my choices and actions. The reconciliation of these seemingly contradictory ideas came through the recognition that time itself might not be linear, that the distinction between past and future might be a function of consciousness rather than a fundamental feature of reality. If time was not linear, if past and future existed simultaneously in some realm beyond ordinary consciousness, then the events of my life could have been arranged in accordance with a pattern that was simultaneously chosen by me freely and predetermined as part of an eternal design. I was both the author of my life and the character living it, both the creator of the pattern and the expression of the pattern unfolding through time. The mile marker had been a way of marking this threshold, a way of calling myself to attention at the moment when I was ready to recognize this truth about the nature of my existence and my consciousness. The discovery of the cabin in the journals had been a way of confirming this understanding, of providing evidence that transcended the boundaries of ordinary delusion or imaginative construction. The synchronicity of finding the old journal in my mother's possessions, the remarkable alignment between what I had written as a teenager and the experiences I was having in my present life, had sealed the confirmation, had moved the understanding from the realm of philosophical abstraction into the realm of lived reality. In the years that followed this confirmation, I found myself living a life that was fundamentally different from the life I had been living before the discovery of the mile marker. I made different choices about my career and my relationships, choices that seemed to arise spontaneously from a deeper understanding of what my life was meant to be about, choices that aligned with the pattern that I had apparently set out for myself in that realm beyond ordinary time. I found that when I relaxed into trust in this deeper pattern, when I stopped struggling against what seemed to be the natural unfolding of events in my life, things seemed to flow with a kind of ease and synchronicity that I had never experienced before. I continued to experience meaningful coincidences, continued to notice moments in which events seemed to arrange themselves in patterns of significance. I developed the ability to recognize these moments with increasing accuracy, to understand what they were communicating to me about the direction my life should take or the lessons I needed to learn. I found that people were drawn to me with increasing frequency to discuss questions about the nature of consciousness and reality, about the possibility of meaningful synchronicity in their own lives, about their own experiences of living in a way that seemed to be guided by some force or intelligence beyond their ordinary conscious understanding. The mile marker had been the beginning of a journey that continued to unfold in my life, a journey of increasing recognition of the way that consciousness could transcend the limitations of ordinary space-time and could arrange the events of experience in patterns of profound meaning and purpose. The discovery had initially appeared as a strange and disturbing anomaly, something that seemed to threaten my sense of reality and my mental stability. But it had gradually transformed into a gift, a way of awakening to a deeper understanding of what I was and what my life was actually about. I never returned to the cabin in the forest, though I thought about it frequently and considered making the journey back to that location. Part of me understood that the cabin and the journals existed in a realm that transcended ordinary geography and temporal succession, that returning to the physical location would not add anything to the understanding that I had already gained. The physical place had served its purpose, had provided the environment and the context in which I could integrate a realization that had been trying to emerge in my consciousness for decades. Once that purpose had been served, the location itself became less important than the transformation that had been catalyzed by the encounter with it. The mile marker had my name on it because it was a marker placed by the deepest part of myself, the part that existed in a realm beyond ordinary time and space, a part that was attempting to communicate with the conscious self that I inhabited in ordinary reality. It had succeeded in that communication, had awakened in me a recognition of the extraordinary nature of my own existence, had pointed me toward the understanding that consciousness was far more vast and far more intentional in its operations than I had ever previously recognized. I reached the mile marker and discovered that it bore my name, and in that discovery, I found myself. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.